You are very welcome to this quick question and answer session. I'm going to jump into the YouTube Studio app and answer a few random questions by clicking the question mark button and see what's there. We've had a couple of delays on the main channel because of health issues and some unexpected medical issues on top of the health issues, and we are on course for Saturday afternoon. The video is already 40% done. I'm excited to share it. I think it could be in some ways the best video on the main channel, but we never know. It depends on what you think about it. We're in, and the first question is from Celednikov that I can see, and it's about Russia's collapse. Do you think Putin's regime's collapse is inevitable? Yes, in the sense that it'll eat itself up at some point. I have large hopes the new free Russia will be created after the war. It depends what after the war means. In Putin's sense, the war isn't just about Ukraine, and it's not clear how the war could even end at all. And new generations of Russians are now being prepared for the prospect of some kind of a total war against the West in the future. But while the Putin regime is in a slow downward spiral, if what we're talking about is Russia's collapse, then I'd be skeptical. I myself say that Russia's borders could begin to drift, because what can you do? I mean, you can't go around shifting borders like Putin is doing and not expect them to shift against your will within your country too. But if you take the cumulative discussion of Russia's breakup in all the major newspapers in the West, then it probably 10x exaggerates the genuinely real but much smaller prospects of that happening. CHRW 123. How is a semi-autonomous government department supposed to operate autonomously if the Kremlin forbids to criticize their actions? That's about my discussions of the propaganda machine. So think of the propaganda machine as some kind of a craft that's floating alongside the Kremlin, and there are signals sent back and forth, but they aren't really direct edicts. So the propaganda machine has to say, well, how are we expected to service the Kremlin? Let's invent our own scripts, our own methodologies, as long as they're roughly faithful to what we're asked for. And that would absolutely include saturation of the informational environment with incompatible messages. So it's a post-truth, it's a systemic post-truth program. And the autonomy lies in the fact that when they feel that they have been unfaithful to the Kremlin, or they've done something that the Kremlin wouldn't like, the idea is that they self-correct. So that's where the autonomy lies. It's a completely functional institution insofar as it's servicing the Kremlin, but it's also not devoid of some power of its own to even inflect the steps and directions the Kremlin takes. What's changed recently is that they are much more terrified of getting something wrong. And so instead of taking a step left and a step right, as they normally would, they kind of rotate in circles and freak out because they're nervous that they're going to get it wrong. Hofimaniac, this is under the Noam Chomsky video, do you really need to critique a 93-year-old? Maybe we should start to deconstruct the idea that with age comes wisdom and stop listening to people over 80. That's the opposite of the truth. I mean, look at me. I am engaged in a very slow way, but professionally, with philosophy, and particularly in moral philosophy. We often like to say that philosophers reach their peak after 70. There are other professions where that happens. In classical music, conducting is a good example where people often reach their peak after 70 because motoric output is less essential to what a conductor does. So there are many kinds of human enterprise that are about expression or understanding that really would be improved if biologically humans lived not till 90 if things go well, but till 110. And so long as everything is working reasonably well, I think we need to listen to, people who are old all the time. And the two leading philosophers in the realm of morals and politics today are Alistair McIntyre, who's 93, and Chuck Taylor, who's 91, 92, 91. And just about they've both been functioning pretty well up until recently, and long may that continue. So not at all. I am in fact just perennially frustrated by how there's this absolutely real capacity for people to improve in that 90 to 110 range, but they don't get the chance because they're human. Gap. Please feel better soon. Gap. Thank you. What is Michael Bohm's purpose in the propaganda sphere? Michael Bohm is a guy who appears on Russian propaganda TV. He is American. I don't want to discuss the financial arrangement or lack thereof of his appearances, because I'm not on top of that. But basically, he tries to give a Western perspective, but it's part of a bit of staged theater. So let's say, a bit what he might say and a bit of what I might say. He would say that he gets a critical anti-Kremlin voice out onto Russian TV. I say that he is part of a script in which he is a little puppy that gets beaten up on TV. And I say that if anything, it undermines the capacity of Russians to remotely access an anti-regime perspective. So I think what he does is not constructive. He would probably argue that it is. Objectively, many E's, asks, wasn't it obvious Putin wanted to invade anyway and use NATO as an excuse? Sorry, that's not a question. Would you prefer the US or Russia to liberate your country? No contest, I'm afraid. The Russian liberation, is really not feeling very nice at the moment to millions of Ukrainians. And we're talking about all kinds of descending consequences of the hardship that Ukraine is going through. There's somebody who needs a medical procedure and they can't get it. And as a result, their family is under stress. And then as a result, somebody in their family loses their health. So these extraordinary repercussions of this calamity that the Russian regime is so needlessly imposing on its neighbor go far beyond just dead, not dead, injured, not injured. It's absolutely ghastly what Ukraine's gonna be going through, is going through over the next few weeks. No thank you to that kind of liberation. Antonio Bakula asks, hello Vlad, I want to thank you for this content. Why didn't Putin invade Ukraine during the Trump presidency? It seems to me that at that point support for Ukraine may have been lower. Putin has the sense that the West is in a process of decline, and so to him the later the better, but it was still too early now, he might think. If there is a single mistake he thinks he made, it's possibly that the West is not as declined as he had hoped. Putin's experience of the Trump administration is very, very negative. And he thought that the Biden administration would be much easier to run over. And that's simply because there was a disconnect between Trump himself and Trump's administration. That was actually very tough on Russia. I mean, Trump's problem, and I predict he will still fail to overcome it, even though he can wreak a lot of havoc, is that he failed, unlike other leaders of his ilk, to generate a stable and efficacious elite around him that bought into his program. So he remained a kind of a sole agent. And that was a problem. But there's much more to say about this. It's interesting. Real Foe seems to say, it seems Elon Musk and the extremes have turned Twitter into a free speech platform. what's the end game? Is it to finance the Mars thing? What is going on? Well, it's not to finance the Mars thing or finance anything. Big picture. Abstracting away from the small picture, where we can indeed say, yes, all of these things are going wrong and it affects journalistic work, it affects discourse negatively. You can discuss all of that, but and debate that too. But Twitter was conducive to democratic decline before Musk. Twitter is conducive to democratic decline after Musk. We can debate that one private hand or one potato chip company is better or worse than another, but the key issue is that we haven't found a better way of running our public squares except by having various random potato chip companies with no legitimacy to do anything political. And it is a political enterprise to run a public square. End up with public squares being in the hands of various potato chip companies, and then we have visceral fights about how one potato chip company is more toxic than another. That's not the issue. We need a situation whereby our answers to what is going on the platform, how the algorithms work there, are somehow tied to procedures that are democratically acceptable to us. And we haven't solved that problem, but it's a very important conversation to keep having. And I'm very grateful to people who are having this conversation on a high level. Is it possible that Putin is becoming burnt out and coming to the realization that the level of damage he has caused Russia is too much and so on? I think he's done the right thing in the wrong way at the wrong time, but he kind of had to do it anyway, is his feeling. So the idea that he's becoming burnt out with his project and that he might say, screw it, about this whole business of escalation against the West, that I think isn't on the cards. If anything, he's more fixed on that today than he was before. And that is why so many Russian kids, and I mean kids, children, are now exposed to a level of toxic propaganda in the school system that's designed to at least cover the option of these children need to be mobilized in the future for some kind of total war. Which strong man would step in to replace Putin? Well, we've got a couple of best case scenario pictures that we could look to, and that's the emergence of Khrushchev after Stalin, roughly, and the emergence of Gorbachev roughly after the semi-dead people that were in between him and Brezhnev. And so what we've got there is a situation where somebody's picked because they're amenable and perceived as weak, but it turns out that they're only weak on the terms of the people who perceive them as weak. They're less brutal and so on, but they're actually strong and they're able to hold a course very, very finely. It would be marvelous if that kind of weak, moderate, quote unquote, was put into power after Putin, but it turned out that they had more spine to begin backing out of some of the mess that this regime has got us, the whole world, into, and Russia too. Major JD asks, another thing is that the majority of Russian men engage in violence. Russian women seem to be better quality than Russian men. That's just my experience. I mean, these are delicate distinctions, but I'm comfortable to go there. I think that when you spend a lot of time in Russia, you do notice a difference in quality between the men and the women. And then you do have the right to start a conversation about where all the men have gone in the 20th century. Russia was systematically eradicating and demotivating its best males during the 20th century. And is that palpable? If you go and see that culture, it seems to me that it is. What does wokeness have to do with the invasion of Ukraine? This is under the Jordan Peterson video by Akira Suzami. Nothing. It's purely exploitative bit of political technology by the Putin regime to use Western identity politics to their advantage. Now, don't confuse that with the proposition that there isn't a problem with Western identity politics. There is, and there's also a very big problem about people who are not on the right failing to recognize the problem even when it is in front of their eyes. And we're going to talk about that. But it's a purely technological exploitative relationship. Putin is not triggered, funnily enough, by trans people. He's just not. He's not triggered by gay people. And that again is an interesting commentary on the Russian regime. These extraordinary homophobic turns that we're seeing now in that regime aren't really a product of great sort of psychopathological homophobic tendencies. It's political technology to a great extent. Vladimir Solovyov, the repulsive Russian propagandist, our Bauer, said on TV that Kazakhstan is full of fascists and shares a large border with Russia. I live in northern Kazakhstan. What's that about? Look, I think that one generally should feel safer now about Russia, at least in the short to medium term, after they've got involved in the way they have in Ukraine. And what we want is for Russia to collapse even more dramatically in its ambitions in Ukraine. And that actually would, for the medium term, make countries around Russia safer. So what we're going to see is, and already seeing, is a diminution of Russia's not just hard but soft power in the region. Anja Fark asks, when will this war end? What are we going to do about this threatening fascist country? Well, we're going to have to see how far Russia fascicizes, but it's already a situation whereby the toxicity in the culture is so great, you're not going to get rid of it just by toppling the regime. So there's going to have to be some process of dePutinization, or whatever you might want to call it, if we are going to see Russia return to an adequate dialogue with itself, which is a precondition for anything else really happening that's constructive, involving Russia's domestic affairs or Russia's foreign policy. I appreciate and enjoy your insight. I have a dear friend who, to my dismay, supports Russia in this war on the basis that the globalists might be defeated at all costs. And let me just check if my keys are in my pocket. No, I don't see them. I think the globalists stole them. I think the globalists, they've got it. I think they've got me. I think the problem is that it's absolutely the wrong thing to start arguing back by saying these are 4 objections to your thesis about globalists. There's one conversation about somebody's information diet. So that's a very important question. But there's another conversation about trust. There's a little video on the main channel about trust and different emotions we feel that lead us to lose trust in public institutions. We might feel powerless, we might feel betrayed, but we might also feel lost, like these institutions just making no sense to us and they seem opaque to us. So it's very important to not call people who are caught up in this wave of mistrust morons. They're not morons. In many ways, their response is intelligent, even though it might lack a little bit of robustness and truthfulness. And so we've got to take it very, very seriously and keep engaging with it, because it's not a kind of deformation. It's a genuine cultural crisis we're facing, and we've got to address it without starting every conversation with the idea that these people should just wise up. That's about it for now, but I'm going to see you very soon on the main channel. Lots and lots of love.